The slap landed before anyone could breathe. Claire Bennett didn't flinch, didn't stumble, didn't make a sound. She stood in the center of Red Harbor Naval Medical Center's combat hall, one hand loose at her side, the other still holding a medical clipboard, while Commander Ethan Cole's palm print bloomed red across her left cheekbone. 47 sailors watched. Not one of them moved. "You don't belong here," Cole said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You're a liability to every person in this building." Someone in the back row laughed, then a few more. Claire's eyes stayed level, calm in a way that made the Fleet Command Master Chief standing near the rear exit go very, very still. Because he recognized that stillness. He'd seen it once before, in a classified briefing room, 6 years ago, attached to a name he wasn't supposed to know. If this story already has you on edge, you're exactly where I need you. Follow along to the very end, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. But Claire Bennett arrived at Red Harbor Naval Medical Center on a Tuesday in March, which was already the wrong day to start anything at that facility. Tuesdays were Commander Cole's evaluation days, and Commander Cole's evaluation days had a way of turning into public theater where he was always the lead. She came with a transfer packet, a single duffel bag, and a service record that had more redacted lines than readable text. The intake officer at the front desk, a young petty officer named Damian Ruiz, flipped through the packet twice, frowning. "Says here you're nursing staff," he said. "Combat medicine rotation?" "That's right," Claire said. He looked up. She was 31, blonde, average height, the kind of face that didn't register as memorable on first pass. She wasn't in uniform yet, just civilian clothes and a worn canvas jacket with no markings. "You've got a lot of black lines in here," he said carefully. "I know." He stamped the packet and handed it back without asking anything else. Smart kid. She found her locker, changed into scrubs, and had been on the floor for approximately 40 minutes before she heard Cole's voice carrying down the corridor from the training wing. Loud. Performed. The voice of someone who needed the room to understand he was in charge before he'd said anything worth listening to. She didn't go looking. She had wound assessments to complete on 3 post-surgical patients, and that was where her attention belonged. But the training hall and the medical ward shared a connecting corridor, a design flaw in Red Harbor's original construction that nobody had ever bothered to fix. And by early afternoon, the noise coming from that direction was impossible to ignore. Not because it was violent, because it was mean in the specific surgical way that institutions sometimes permit when the right person is doing it to the wrong person. She finished her last chart note, set down her pen, and walked toward it. The training hall at Red Harbor held roughly 60 people comfortably. There were 47 in there when Claire pushed through the door, most of them standing in a rough horseshoe around the center mat. Commander Ethan Cole stood at the middle of it, early 50s, thick through the shoulders, the kind of career military bearing that had gone slightly soft, but not enough that he'd noticed. He was doing a demonstration. Hand-to-hand combat basics, the kind of refresher drill that got scheduled every quarter and that everyone attended and nobody remembered 2 days later. Except Cole had apparently decided this one needed a prop. He'd already picked her out before she walked in. She understood that immediately from the way his eyes moved to her the second the door opened, the way the slight smile on his face sharpened into something more deliberate. "Perfect timing," he said. "We were just discussing whether medical staff should be required to meet the same physical readiness standards as combat personnel." He looked around the room. "What do you all think? Should a nurse be able to handle herself in a hostile situation?" A few polite, non-committal sounds from the crowd. Nobody wanted to answer that directly. Cole gestured toward Claire. "Come on in. Let's use this as a teaching moment." She could have refused. She almost did. But she'd walked into the room, which meant she'd made a choice, and backing out now would only give him more material to work with. She set her clipboard on a folded table near the wall and walked to the edge of the mat. "Cole?" said a voice near the back. She glanced. Fleet Command Master Chief Raymond Pryor was standing near the rear exit, late 50s, sharp eyes, the kind of stillness in his posture that only came from decades of genuine fieldwork. He was watching Cole with an expression she couldn't fully read from across the room. Cole didn't look at him. "Master Chief, you might want to take a different approach today." A beat. Cole's smile didn't move. Noted. He turned back to Claire. What's your name, Lieutenant? Bennett? Bennett. He said it like he was testing the weight of it and finding it wanting. How long have you been with us? Since this morning? First day. He let that land for the room, and already volunteering for demonstrations. That's either confidence or ignorance. We'll figure out which. A ripple of laughter. Not everyone. Maybe 8 or 10 people. The ones who read the room and decided Cole was the safest bet. The rest stayed quiet in that specific military quiet that meant they didn't approve, but also weren't going to say so. Cole walked a slow circle around her. She tracked him without moving her head, just her eyes, which she kept neutral and loose. The problem with medical staff in combat-adjacent facilities, he said, addressing the room while keeping her in his peripheral, is that they develop a false sense of safety. They're protected roles, non-combatants, so they never really train for what happens when the situation goes bad. He stopped in front of her. Bennett, if someone grabbed you right now, right here, what would you do? Depends on the grab, she said. More laughter, this time broader. She hadn't meant it as a joke, but she let it pass. Cole's eyes went flat for a second. Just a flicker, barely visible. The kind of micro-expression that happened when someone wasn't used to getting an answer back. Then he smiled wider. Fair enough, he said. He looked at the crowd. Defensive posture, everyone. Watch what medical response looks like in a physical situation. He turned back to her and squared his stance, clearly intending to run through a scripted demonstration. Grab her arm, she performs a defensive response. Everyone sees that even nurses can follow procedure. Standard theater. Except he didn't run through the script. He shifted his weight and shoved her. Not a grab, not a controlled demonstration grip, but a hard two-handed shove to her shoulders that sent her back 2 steps and got a sharp intake of breath from several people in the crowd. She recovered her footing, looked at him. Cole shrugged at the room. Lost my balance, he said. And the 8 people who laughed before laughed again. Master Chief Pryor said quietly but distinctly, Cole. Cole still didn't look at him. What happened over the next 4 minutes was less a training demonstration and more a sustained exercise in Cole finding the line and stepping over it by small degrees. He corrected her stance in front of everyone, using his hands when he didn't need to. He referenced her nursing background 3 times in ways that made it sound like a character flaw. When she asked him to clarify a procedure, he repeated his answer loudly and slowly, as if she'd had trouble hearing rather than trouble with his logic, and a few more people in the crowd picked up on his cue and smiled. She stayed quiet. She kept her expression neutral. She did not give him the reaction he was fishing for, which she understood was making it worse, because men like Cole needed the loop to close. They needed you to break or apologize or get angry, because any of those responses confirmed the power structure they were demonstrating. Her stillness was a disruption he didn't know how to process. So he escalated. She saw it coming by the way his jaw set. A small tightening, the physical tell of someone who'd run out of patience with their own script. He moved toward her and brought his right hand across in an open palm strike. It connected with her left cheekbone. Not a training tap, not a demonstration. A full-force slap that snapped her head slightly to the right and sent a crack of sound through the room that silenced everything. 47 people stopped breathing. Cole stood there, hand still slightly raised, chin up, clearly calculating whether what he'd just done was going to be a problem. Master Chief Pryor, near the back, had gone completely still. Claire turned her head back slowly. She looked at Cole. Her expression had not changed at all, which was somehow the most frightening thing about the moment, though nobody in that room could have articulated exactly why. The heat in her cheek was immediate and real, and she was aware of it in the distant, informational way that she was aware of most physical input, her body cataloging data rather than sounding alarms. She'd been hit harder, in worse places, in situations where she couldn't afford to respond even slightly. Cole's confidence came back by increments. She wasn't reacting. In his read of the room, that meant she was frozen, overwhelmed, deferring, unable to process what had happened. Like I said, he told the crowd, liability. That was when she moved. It was not a dramatic sequence. It was not choreographed or performative. It lasted, by later estimates from the people watching, approximately 1.8 seconds. She stepped left, inside his reach. Her left hand came up and redirected the arm he reflexively raised. Not hard, just enough to break his weight distribution. Her right came across, palm flat, and compressed the nerve cluster at the base of his neck just enough to cause a full-body flinch. His knees buckled fractionally. She was already behind him, her right forearm across his upper chest, the leverage clean and controlled, taking him down to the mat in a single fluid motion that ended with Commander Ethan Cole on his back, one of his wrists locked at an angle that meant any attempt to sit up would hurt considerably. She stepped back. She was not breathing hard. Cole stared up at the ceiling. Nobody in the room made a sound. The technique she'd used didn't have a civilian name. It existed in a training manual with a classification level that none of the 47 people in that room were cleared to access. She'd learned it in a building that didn't officially exist from an instructor whose identity she still wasn't authorized to disclose. She picked her clipboard up off the table near the wall. "I have patience," she said, and walked out. The training hall stayed quiet for a long time after she left. Cole got himself up off the mat. Nobody helped him. Nobody said anything. The 8 people who'd been laughing were studying the floor. Master Chief Pryor watched Cole smooth his uniform and attempt to rebuild his expression into something functional. Pryor had been in the Navy for 31 years. He'd served 3 deployments in places he still couldn't discuss at dinner parties, and he'd shared field positions with some of the most capable people the military had ever quietly produced. He knew what he'd just seen. He pulled out his phone and sent a message. Claire spent the remainder of the afternoon in the post-surgical ward, which was where she preferred to be. Less noise, clearer problems, work that required her whole attention and rewarded it. She changed dressings on 2 patients and sat for 20 minutes with a third, a 24-year-old seaman named Torres, who was 3 weeks out from a training accident and struggling with it in ways his charts didn't fully capture. "Does it get easier?" Torres asked her. He wasn't asking about the wound. "Some things do," she said. "Some things you just get better at carrying." He thought about that. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "It's supposed to be true," she said. Reassuring would have been a lie. He laughed, which pulled at something in his side and made him wince, but he kept laughing. She left the ward at 1800 and walked back toward the staff locker room, taking the longer route through the east corridor out of habit. She always mapped buildings in the first few days, identified the secondary paths, noted which doors were alarmed and which weren't. Old habit. Completely unnecessary in her current context. She'd never quite managed to turn it off. She was passing the administrative corridor when she heard her name. "Lieutenant Bennett?" She stopped. The woman who'd spoken was standing outside the medical director's office. Dr. Sylvia Horn, Red Harbor's chief medical officer, mid-50s. The kind of controlled professional composure that meant she'd had this conversation before and didn't enjoy it. "A moment," Dr. Horn said. Claire followed her inside. The office was small and organized with the specific intensity of someone who didn't have enough time and knew it. Dr. Horn sat behind her desk and folded her hands on top of it. "I've just come from a conversation with Captain Walsh," she said. "Okay," said Claire. "You assaulted a superior officer in a training hall with 47 witnesses." "I responded to a physical assault," Claire said. "There are also 47 witnesses to that." Dr. Horn looked at her steadily. "I understand the distinction. So does Captain Walsh. That's why this conversation is happening in my office and not an MP station." A pause. "However, Commander Cole has significant standing in this command. His training program is cited in 3 separate facility evaluations. He has the captain's ear." Claire waited. "I'm telling you this because you've been here for 8 hours, and I'd rather you stay." Dr. Horn picked up a pen, set it down. "But I need to know what I'm working with. Your transfer records have more classified notation than I've ever seen on a medical assignment." "I know. What I can access doesn't explain it." "It wouldn't," Claire said. A long silence. Dr. Horn studied her. Claire let herself be studied. "Go home," Dr. Horn finally said. "Come back tomorrow. Be professional. Don't give him another opening." "I haven't given him any openings," Claire said mildly. "That's been the problem." She left. The walk to her temporary quarters took her through the facility's west courtyard, which at this hour was mostly empty. One junior officer eating alone at a bench, 3 maintenance workers loading equipment into a truck. She'd been assigned a room in the temporary housing block while her permanent quarters were processed, which was fine. She'd slept in considerably less comfortable places. She was halfway across the courtyard when her phone buzzed. Unregistered number. But the prefix was one she recognized from a format she'd been told 3 years ago to never forget. She stopped walking, answered. Bennett. The voice on the other end was male, measured, and not wasting any time. This is General Marcus Vane, Joint Special Operations Command. Don't say my name. She was quiet for a moment. Understood. We're aware of the incident today, he said. She processed that. How? Prior. He flagged it within the hour. He recognized the technique. Of course he had. Prior had been at Kadir Station in 2019. He'd been in the back row of a different briefing when her name had come up. She'd never spoken to him directly, but she'd known he'd made her the second she walked into that training hall. The recognition had been mutual. What do I need to know? She said. Cole's not just arrogant, Vane said. He's been under informal review for 8 months. Pattern of conduct. Multiple complaints, all buried. Walsh covers for him. You may have just moved the timeline up. That wasn't my intention, she said. I know. A beat. But it's going to happen anyway, Bennett, and when it does, it's going to involve you whether you want it to or not. Are you clear on your current status? Civilian medical role, active service designation, reserve status. Your reserve classification is higher than that, Vane said. If things escalate tomorrow, which I think they will, you may want to remember what you're actually authorized to do. The call ended. Claire stood in the courtyard for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. The maintenance workers finished loading the truck and drove away. The junior officer collected his food wrapper and went inside. She went to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and spent several minutes looking at the wall. She'd taken the nursing role because she'd needed something that mattered in a quieter register. 3 years after her last classified deployment, after the debrief that had lasted 4 days and left her sleeping badly for 6 months, she'd needed to be somewhere that the stakes were real, but the methods were human. Stitches and dressings and the kind of honesty that happened in hospital rooms at 2 a.m, where people said things to nurses that they couldn't say to anyone else because the nurse was there, and the fear was real. She hadn't been looking for a fight. She'd walked into that training hall because the noise was affecting patient care, because Cole's voice had been carrying down the corridor, because she'd made a decision. She lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling, and didn't sleep particularly well. By morning, the incident had moved through the facility's informal networks with the speed and completeness that only small, closed communities can manage. She could tell by the way people looked at her in the breakfast line, some with obvious curiosity, some with the pointedly studied non-reaction of people who'd already taken sides. 2 junior nurses she passed in the locker room said good morning in the careful, slightly too loud way that meant they'd been talking about her 30 seconds before and wanted her to know they were on her team without actually committing to anything. Damian Ruiz, the petty officer who'd processed her paperwork the previous day, stopped her in the corridor near the surgical ward. People are saying you put Cole on the ground in under 2 seconds, he said. Are they? Is it true? She thought about it. Closer to 2 seconds than not. He nodded like he'd already known the answer and just needed confirmation. He reported you this morning. Formal complaint. Captain Walsh pulled your duty assignment for today pending review. She'd expected that. Thank you for telling me. The corpsmen in Training Hall B have been timing how long 2 seconds is since last night, he said. You know, with stopwatches. She walked away before she did something she'd regret, like smiling. The duty suspension meant she was effectively confined to the residence block and administrative areas for the day. She used the time to review patient files she'd been copied on and to walk the facility's perimeter twice. Still mapping, still noting, unable to stop being what she was, regardless of what her current badge said. By early afternoon, the facility's mood had shifted. She noticed it first in the faces of the people she passed. A different quality to the looks, less speculative and more loaded, like people who'd been told something they were still processing. Then she saw 2 military police officers moving with purpose toward the administrative wing. Then she heard from somewhere down the east corridor the sound of a voice she didn't recognize. Deep, authoritative, carrying the specific acoustic weight of someone addressing a room they've just taken control of. And then she heard the vehicles. She was near the facility's main entrance when they arrived. A convoy of 3 dark military transports pulling into Red Harbor's front approach. And something about their configuration, the specific way they positioned, told her this wasn't a routine visit. She'd seen that parking formation in 4 different countries. It meant the people inside weren't arriving for a conversation. They were arriving to settle something. The main doors opened and the first boots through them were not soft. She turned and faced the corridor, and everything that had been quiet about the last 36 hours went loud at once. The boots hit the floor in a rhythm that wasn't hurried and didn't need to be. 6 men in service dress came through the main entrance first. Not MPs, not standard security, but the kind of personnel who moved through institutional space like they'd already been briefed on the floor plan and found nothing surprising about it. Behind them came a woman in her mid-40s, colonel's insignia, the kind of face that processed information faster than it expressed it. And behind her, moving at the pace of someone who had nowhere more important to be, came a man in a general's uniform that Claire recognized by its cut before she recognized the face. General Marcus Vane looked older in person than he'd sounded on the phone. Not diminished, just real. The way people always looked when you finally placed a voice into a body after years of knowing only one or the other. He saw her immediately. He didn't salute. Not yet. He just held her gaze for 2 seconds. The specific, compressed communication of people who'd been briefed on each other and were now confirming that the briefing was accurate. And then he looked away and addressed the facility's entry desk without breaking stride. "We need the medical director, the commanding officer, and every available witness from the Training Hall B incident yesterday. Conference room 20 minutes. The petty officer at the desk, not Ruiz, a different one, younger, clearly underprepared for this, said, "Sir, I'll need to confirm." "You'll confirm by making the calls," Vane said, not unkindly. 20 minutes. He moved past the desk and toward the administrative wing, and his people moved with him, and the facility's morning shifted on its axis in a way that Claire suspected it wouldn't fully recover from. She stayed where she was for a moment. The colonel, she hadn't caught a name yet, peeled away from the group and walked back toward Claire, stopped 3 feet away and looked at her the way people in military administration looked at personnel files they hadn't finished reading. "Lieutenant Bennett." "Colonel. I'm Colonel Diane Ferris, JSOC Legal. You've been suspended from duty as of this morning. Are you aware?" "I am." "Good." Ferris glanced toward the entrance, then back. "Don't go anywhere near Commander Cole today. Don't seek him out. Don't respond if he finds you. Do you understand why I'm telling you that?" "Because anything I say to him becomes part of the record." "Because anything you say to him becomes part of the record," Ferris confirmed. "And right now the record is doing just fine without your help." She paused. "You have an attorney on retainer?" "No." Ferris's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, more the resigned acknowledgement of someone who'd had this particular conversation too many times. "I'll have someone from JAG make contact by end of day. In the meantime." She produced a card and held it out. "You need anything? You call that number. Not the front desk, not Dr. Horn, that number." Claire took the card. "What's actually happening?" she asked. Ferris looked at her for a beat. "What's happening is that a pattern of conduct that's been papered over for the better part of a year just became impossible to paper over. What's also happening is that you walked into the middle of it on your first day, which is either very bad timing or very good timing, depending on how this goes." She turned to follow the group. "Stay available." Claire watched her go. The facility had gone quiet in the way that buildings went quiet when everyone inside them was trying very hard to sound like they weren't listening. She could feel it in the corridors as she walked. Doors fractionally ajar, conversations that stopped a beat too early. The weight of an institutional community that had just understood something was happening and was rapidly calculating where to stand. She went back to the residence block and sat down at the small desk in her room. Opened her laptop, pulled up the patient files she'd been reviewing and stared at them without reading them for about 40 seconds before she closed the laptop and accepted that she wasn't going to accomplish anything useful right now. The card Ferris had given her was plain white stock, a phone number, a suite designation, and the letters JSOC-LA in small print at the bottom. Legal affairs. They'd brought their own legal team on a one-day timeline, which meant this wasn't a reaction to yesterday's incident. This had been in motion for longer than that. Vane had said 8 months. A pattern of conduct. Multiple complaints, all buried. She sat with that for a while. Thought about Torres in the post-surgical ward, who asked honest questions and deserved honest answers. Thought about the petty officer at the front desk who'd stamped her paperwork without asking what all the black lines meant. Thought about the 8 people in Training Hall B who'd laughed on cue and what it cost a person to unlearn that particular reflex. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, different prefix this time. She answered. Bennett? Pryor's voice. Direct, no preamble. You doing okay? Yes, Master Chief. I want you to know, he said, that I filed my own report last night, independently, before Vane's office reached out. A pause. I want you to know that because I don't want you thinking everything that's happening today is something someone else started. I understand. I've been watching Cole run that training hall for 3 years, Pryor said. I put things in writing twice. Both times, nothing. His voice didn't carry particular bitterness about that, just the flat factuality of someone who'd kept track. Yesterday was different. Yesterday there were 47 witnesses and security footage and a technique that has exactly one institutional origin point. Another pause. Does Vane know you're going to be difficult about the record? I haven't been difficult about anything. You told Ferris you didn't have an attorney. I don't. You turned down JAG representation at Fort Meade in 2021, Pryor said. I'm looking at a notation right now. She was quiet for a moment. That situation was different. They're all different until they're the same, he said. Take the JAG contact. Let Ferris do her job. You have a habit of handling things alone that you don't need to handle alone. The call ended. She sat with that one longer. The conference room in Red Harbor's administrative wing was rated for 20 people and currently held 31, which said something about the gravity of the situation and something else about how poorly the facility had planned for it. General Vane stood at the head of the table. Captain Walsh sat to his left, 60s, heavy through the face, the look of a man who'd been woken from a comfortable certainty and hadn't yet identified what had replaced it. Commander Cole sat 3 seats down from Walsh, which was far enough to imply distance and close enough to imply ongoing allegiance. Cole had composed himself overnight into something approaching controlled. He'd changed into a fresh uniform. He held his hands flat on the table in front of him and kept his expression at a neutral that had clearly cost him some effort to construct. Colonel Ferris sat across from Walsh with a folder open in front of her. The other JSOC personnel positioned themselves around the room's perimeter in the specific way that meant they were documenting without being asked. Vane looked around the table and did not look pleased, though displeasure was probably too human a word for his expression. He looked like a man who'd been given a set of facts and found them straightforward in ways that weren't going to be comfortable for several people in this room. We're going to go through what happened yesterday, he said. Not the incident in isolation, the pattern. He looked at Walsh. Captain, I'd like your account of Commander Cole's formal complaint against Lieutenant Bennett. Walsh cleared his throat. The commander filed a complaint citing unauthorized physical contact with a superior officer during a training exercise. The training exercise he initiated, Ferris said, without looking up from her folder. Walsh stopped, recalibrated. The exercise included a demonstration component. Did the demonstration component include striking an enlisted medical officer with an open palm? Vane asked. The room was very quiet. Cole's hands stayed flat on the table. The strike was part of the demonstration, he said, a controlled exercise to assess response under pressure. The strike was not in your training plan, Ferris said. Your submitted lesson outline for yesterday's session is in this folder, Commander. Would you like me to read the relevant section? Cole said nothing. The footage from Training Hall B's security cameras was recovered this morning, Vane said. We've reviewed 40 minutes of it. The strike is visible. Lieutenant Bennett's response is visible. The timing is consistent with what 14 witnesses have stated independently. He paused. I want to be clear about what we're establishing here, Captain. This is not a gray area. Walsh's face had gone through several transitions in the last 2 minutes. He was currently somewhere between careful and calculating. I understand the concern, General. However, Commander Cole has a commendable record. His record is what we're currently auditing, Vane said. The word auditing landed in the room like something heavy being set on a glass table. Cole's composure slipped. Just slightly, a tightening around the jaw, a fractional shift in posture. I've been running this training program for 3 years, he said. My performance evaluations were submitted by Captain Walsh, Ferris said. Another silence. Longer this time. The colonel turned a page in her folder. We have 8 prior complaints filed against Commander Cole over a 26-month period. 6 are from junior personnel, 2 from lateral staff. All 8 were received, logged, and subsequently closed without investigation by this command. She looked up. 3 of them are from female service members citing discriminatory conduct during training exercises. One of those complaints includes a reference to physical contact during a demonstration session. She let that sit. That complaint is dated 14 months ago. Walsh's face had gone flat. Cole said, those complaints were addressed internally. They were closed, Ferris said. Closed is not addressed. Mom, Claire didn't know what was happening in the conference room. She hadn't been asked to attend, which Ferris had explained meant they were building the foundation before calling her in. Standard procedure. She understood it even if sitting in her room waiting felt like something she wasn't built for. She got up around 1400 and went to the hospital wing. Not to her ward, she was still suspended from active duty, but to the small family waiting area near the surgical suite, which was usually empty at this hour and had a window that looked out over the facility's north grounds. She sat there for a while, watched the convoy vehicles parked in the front approach. There were 4 of them now. A 4th had arrived around noon, a different configuration, and she'd noted the change without being able to identify exactly what it meant. The vehicles had a federal quality to them, not purely military, something adjacent. Lieutenant Bennett? She turned. The man in the doorway was young, mid-20s maybe, in service dress with JAG insignia. He had the slightly overwhelmed look of someone who'd been handed an assignment they weren't sure they were senior enough for. I'm Lieutenant Garrison, Judge Advocate General's office. Colonel Ferris asked me to make contact. She mentioned, Claire said. He came in and sat down across from her, set a notepad on his knee, looked at it, then at her, then back at it, making some kind of internal decision. I've looked at what I'm authorized to see of your service record, he said, which isn't much. No, she agreed. I want to ask you something directly, he said, and I want you to know you don't have to answer. This isn't a deposition. This is just me trying to understand what I'm working with. He looked up. Did you use force against Commander Cole? Yes. Was the force proportional to the threat? I used enough force to stop the threat and establish control. I didn't injure him. You could have. She looked at him. Yes. He wrote something. Why didn't you? She thought about how to answer that honestly without sounding like a recruiting poster. Because the situation didn't require it, she said, and because I needed him on the ground, not in medical. Garrison looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. Okay. He wrote something else. The formal complaint Cole filed this morning, it cites you for assaulting a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, and creating a hostile training environment. She kept her expression neutral. We're going to be filing a counter-complaint that addresses each of those charges with reference to the footage and witness statements, he said. That's the easy part. The harder part is that Cole's attorney, he retained private counsel this morning, which is itself somewhat informative, is likely going to argue that your military background creates an asymmetry of force that makes your response disproportionate regardless of the provocation. They're going to argue I should have let him hit me, Claire said. They're going to argue you had options that didn't involve a takedown. I had options that didn't involve letting him establish a precedent, she said, in front of 47 people who are going to spend their careers making decisions about when force is appropriate. If I'd walked away, the lesson they learned was that you absorb it and you file paperwork. That's not the lesson they needed. Garrison was quiet for a moment. Can I write that down? he said. You can. He wrote it down, underlined something. Outside the window, a fifth vehicle was pulling into the facility's front approach. Not a military transport this time. A dark sedan with federal plates, and visible through the window as it stopped, the small antenna cluster on the roof that Claire associated with secure communications. Garrison saw her looking and turned. That's the third time they've added vehicles since this morning, he said, almost to himself. Yes, Claire said. Do you know why? She looked at the sedan and thought about what Vane had told her on the phone. Cole's not just arrogant. Not specifically, she said, which was true. She had a shape in her head, but shapes weren't specifics. Her phone buzzed. Ferris. Conference room. 30 minutes. Bring Garrison. She showed him the message. The young attorney looked at it, then at her, and she could see him recalibrating something about the size of what he'd walked into. He closed his notepad and stood up. I should tell you, he said carefully, that in 4 years of JAG work, I have never been asked to bring my client directly into a JSOC briefing before the investigation is formally opened. Okay, she said. I'm not sure what that means. It means something happened, she said, and they've run out of time to do it in order. She stood up. Let's go. The conference room felt different when she walked into it 30 minutes later. The table had been reorganized. Walsh and Cole were now on the same side, physically separated from everyone else, which was the kind of spatial arrangement that communicated something without anyone having to say it. Vane was standing near the head of the table. Ferris was still in her seat. The additional personnel from the sedan were visible now. 2 of them, neither in uniform, both in the specific professional casual that meant federal agency rather than military branch. One of them was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the relaxed efficiency of someone who billed her time very carefully. She nodded once at Claire when Claire entered the room, the specific nod of someone who'd been briefed and was confirming the briefing. Vane waited until Claire and Garrison were seated before he spoke. I want to thank everyone for being here, he said, and the formality of it was calibrated. This was a record statement, something being said precisely because it would be documented. What I'm about to share affects the scope of this investigation and the timeline in which we're operating. He looked around the table. 14 months ago, a complaint was filed against Commander Cole. In that complaint, a lieutenant junior grade named Sandra Moya described an incident in Training Hall B that included unauthorized physical contact, discriminatory language regarding female combat capability, and what she characterized as deliberate intimidation using her junior rank status. Walsh didn't move. That complaint was closed by this command without investigation or formal response to Lieutenant Moya within 30 days of its receipt. What was not known at the time, and has come to our attention this morning, is that Lieutenant Moya filed a secondary complaint directly with Naval Inspector General's office 4 weeks after the command closure. That complaint was logged, assigned a case number, and subsequently lost in a transfer of IG case files. Cole said, I don't see what... It was found this morning, Ferris said, when we requested Lieutenant Moya's full record. She looked at Cole the way someone looked at a document they'd already finished reading. She's separated from service 6 months after filing. She cited a hostile work environment. She cited specifically this command. The room had a specific quality of silence to it now. Not the silence of people waiting for someone to speak, the silence of people processing something they hadn't wanted to know. There are currently 3 active service members who've been identified as having filed similar complaints within other commands where Cole previously served, Vane said. That information came from the IG file, which apparently had more in it than the initial index suggested. He paused. Which is why we're moving faster than I'd originally anticipated. The woman with the reading glasses pushed up into her hair, opened a folder on the table in front of her. My name is Sandra Keyes, she said, and her voice had the clipped professional cadence of someone who spent a lot of time in rooms where every word would be reviewed later. I'm with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. We've been monitoring this command's complaint processing practices as part of a broader administrative review. Yesterday's incident accelerated our timeline considerably. She looked at Walsh. Captain, your office will be receiving a formal document request by end of business today. I'd encourage full cooperation. Walsh's face had finally settled into something that looked like real fear. Cole was very still. The shape Claire had had in her head, the one she'd said wasn't specifics, was getting considerably more specific. "Lieutenant Bennett," Vane said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you directly, on the record, whether you were aware of any prior complaints against Commander Cole when you reported to this facility." "No, sir," she said. "Were you briefed on the command's complaint history?" "No, sir." "Did you seek out contact with Commander Cole during your first day at this facility?" "No, sir. I responded to noise from the training hall that was audible in the medical ward." "And your response to Commander Cole's physical contact was a defensive response using techniques consistent with my training background," she said. "No more force than the situation required." Garrison, beside her, was writing steadily and had been since she sat down. Vane looked at her for a moment that was a beat longer than professional. "Your service record has a classification level that I can't discuss in this room with everyone currently present," he said. "But I want the people in this room to understand that Lieutenant Bennett's response yesterday was not a loss of control. It was not disproportionate. It was, by any informed measure, exceptionally restrained." He looked at Cole when he said the last word. Cole finally looked away from the table. "I want my attorney," he said. "He's been notified," Ferris said. "He's on his way." "Then I'm not saying anything else until—" "That's fine," Vane said, with the calm of someone who didn't need him to say anything else. "We have enough." Claire was released from the conference room at 17:30. Garrison walked her out and then stood in the corridor outside the administrative wing for a moment, looking at his notepad like it had grown in the last 2 hours. "I've been doing this for 4 years," he said. "You mentioned. I've never seen an IG rep show up same day to a command review." "Timing worked out," Claire said. "Did it?" He looked at her, not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Or did someone make some calls?" She thought about Pryor, about Vane on the phone the previous evening, telling her to remember what she was authorized to do. "I walked into a training hall because the noise was affecting patient care," she said. "Everything after that was other people's choices." Garrison thought about that. "Cole's going to fight this," he said. "Private attorney, 20 years of service, command support from Walsh. Walsh is currently explaining to a DOD Inspector General why 8 complaints were closed without investigation," Claire said. "I checked that command support assumption." He almost smiled, caught it. "Right." She left him there and walked back toward the medical wing, not because she had clearance to work, but because that was where she wanted to be when things felt uncertain. The ward was quieter at this hour, shift change completing, the particular hush of a hospital in the hour before visiting hours ended. She stopped in the doorway of Torres's room. He was awake, propped up on pillows, watching something on a tablet with one earbud in. He pulled the earbud out when he saw her. "You're not supposed to be working," he said. "I'm not working." "Then why are you in my doorway?" She thought about it. "Checking," she said. He looked at her for a second. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "You look like someone who had a really long 2 days." "It's been a long 2 days," she said. He shifted in his bed, which still cost him something. She could see it in the slight catch of his breath, and looked at her with the directness of someone young enough not to have learned to look away from things yet. "Is it true what people are saying?" he asked, "that the general came because of what happened with Cole?" "Something like that. And you're just—" He gestured at the doorway. "Standing here." "Checking," she said again. Torres looked at her for a long moment and then seemed to decide something. "My mom's a nurse," he said. "Has been since before I was born. She used to say the hardest part wasn't the hard shifts. It was the days when someone told her she shouldn't be there." He paused. "She said you just had to be better than the argument." Claire looked at him. "I'm working on that," she said. She walked back down the corridor toward the residence block. Behind her, the administrative wing was still lit up, vehicles still in the front approach. And somewhere inside it, a proceeding was ongoing that she wasn't part of, but that had started in some sense the moment she'd walked through Red Harbor's front door. She was almost at the residence block entrance when her phone rang. Vane. "There's something you need to know," he said. "Cole's attorney just filed an emergency motion to suppress the security footage." She stopped walking. "On what grounds?" He's claiming the camera in Training Hall B wasn't properly logged as an active recording device in the facility's posted surveillance notice. Technical argument, almost certainly wrong, but it'll delay processing for 48 hours while it gets reviewed. A pause. That's not the thing you need to know. She waited. Sandra Moya, Vane said. The lieutenant who filed the complaint 14 months ago, the one who separated from service. Another pause. Her brother is currently a patient at Red Harbor. He came in 4 days ago, traumatic injury from a training accident. Claire was very still. His name is Corporal Daniel Moya, Vane said. Post-surgical ward. He's been here since before you arrived. The thing in Claire's chest that she usually kept very quiet and very contained did something complicated. Torres had said his name earlier in the day. She ran back through the conversation and realized, no, Torres hadn't said a name. Had just said, my mom's a nurse. Not Daniel Moya, different patient. But she'd walked past room 114 that morning. She'd glanced at the chart on the door the way she always did, cataloging, mapping. Daniel Moya, corporal. Admit date March 14th. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because his sister just called this office, Vane said. She found out he was here. She found out about the proceedings against Cole, and she wants to testify. Claire let out a breath. What does that mean for the timeline? She said. It means the 48-hour delay Cole's attorney just bought is going to feel very short, Vane said. And it means that what started as a use of force review is about to become something considerably larger. He paused one more time. I thought you should know before tomorrow. What happens tomorrow? She said. Sandra Moya lands at Ashport Regional at 0630, he said. She'll be at the facility by 800. And Cole's attorney is going to find out that suppressing 48 hours of footage doesn't do much when the person who filed the original complaint is standing in the room. The line went quiet. Claire stood in the dark outside the residence block and thought about a woman who'd filed a report and had it buried, who'd left the service she'd chosen, whose brother was lying in a post-surgical ward 3 buildings away, recovering from something that had nothing to do with any of this. And yet, here they were. All of it converging in the same institution at the same moment the way things did sometimes. Not neatly, not cleanly, but with the specific gravity of things that had been deferred too long. She looked up at the front approach. The 5 vehicles were still there. Somewhere inside the building, Cole was waiting for his attorney. And somewhere above Ashport, Virginia, a plane was already in the air. She didn't sleep much. Not because she was afraid. Fear wasn't quite the right word for what she felt lying on the narrow residence block mattress at 0200, staring at the ceiling tiles. But because the shape of tomorrow had too many variables, and her mind kept running through them the way it always did when something was about to move fast. Old habit from the field. Pre-operation processing. The brain burning through scenarios so that when things went sideways, the body already had a map. She gave up on sleep at 0430 and went for a run in the dark along the facility's perimeter fence. 3 miles. The air was cold and wet with the particular coastal damp of Ashport in March. And by the 2nd mile, her breath was steady and her mind had done what running always made it do. Stopped performing and started functioning. Sandra Moya was landing at 0630. Cole's attorney had bought 48 hours on the footage suppression motion, which meant the formal evidentiary review was paused, but the IG proceeding wasn't. Keys from the DOD Inspector General's office didn't need the footage to conduct her administrative review. She had 8 closed complaints, 3 cross-command incidents, Walsh's failure to act, and now a voluntary witness flying in from wherever Sandra Moya had landed after leaving the service. The footage was important for the use of force adjudication. For the larger pattern, it was almost beside the point. Claire ran the last mile faster than the first 2 and came back to the residence block with her pulse up and her thinking clear. By 0600, she was showered and dressed and sitting at the small desk with her laptop open. Not looking at patient files this time, but at the blank document she'd opened 3 days ago when she'd first arrived and never put anything in. She typed one line. What you're here to do. Then she closed it without saving and went to breakfast. Sandra Moya was 34, 5'6", and wore civilian clothes with the particular posture of someone who'd spent years in uniform and hadn't fully unlearned it. She arrived at Red Harbor's main entrance at 0803. 7 minutes behind Vane's estimate, with a single carry-on and the controlled expression of someone who had made a decision and wasn't available to be talked out of it. Claire knew this because she was in the corridor near the entrance when Moya walked in, not by arrangement. She'd been walking to the medical wing when the door opened, and the two women looked at each other for a second with the mutual recognition of people who'd been told about each other. Moya's eyes were tired, the kind of tired that didn't come from the flight. "Lieutenant Bennett?" she said. "Yes." Moya looked at her for a moment. "I heard what happened in the training hall," she said. "Someone sent me the witness statements. I don't know who." She paused. "I just want you to know that I'm not here because of that." "I know," Claire said. "I'm here because my brother is in that ward." She nodded toward the medical wing. "And because I filed a report 14 months ago and nobody did anything, and if I don't say that out loud in a room where it matters, then I have to figure out how to live with that." Her voice was flat and even in the way of someone who'd rehearsed past the point of emotion into something steadier and more durable. Claire looked at her. "Have you seen Daniel yet?" "I'm going there after." Something moved briefly across Moya's face, not grief exactly, more the complicated arithmetic of someone managing multiple kinds of difficult at once. "I wanted to do this first. While I still had the..." She stopped, recalibrated. "While I was still ready." "Colonel Ferris is in the conference room," Claire said. "Second left from the admin desk." Moya nodded, adjusted the strap of her carry-on, started walking, then stopped. "The technique you used on Cole," she said, without turning around. "Was it clean?" "Yes," Claire said. Moya walked on. Well, the formal hearing convened at 900 in the facility's largest conference room, which still wasn't large enough. Vane sat at the head. Ferris to his left, Garrison beside her. Keys from the IG office had brought a second colleague overnight, a man named Tran who managed the physical documentation with the systematic efficiency of someone who thought in filing categories. Walsh sat on one side of the table with the expression of a man who'd spent the night with his attorney and was now wearing the results of that conversation. Careful, minimized, the posture of someone preparing to be cooperative in the specific way that preserved the most options. Cole was not in the room. That absence landed differently than his presence would have. His attorney, a civilian named Breck, late 40s, the kind of practiced ease that came from a lot of time in military administrative proceedings, sat where Cole would have been and had a folder open in front of him that he kept not looking at. Sandra Moya sat at the far end of the table in a chair someone had added specifically for her. She had her hands folded on the surface in front of her, and she was looking at the middle of the table with the focused stillness of someone who had decided to be a fact and not a feeling in this room. Claire sat beside Garrison. She was not a principal in this proceeding. She was a witness with a pending counter-complaint and an ongoing duty suspension, and she was here because Ferris had asked her to be, and because Garrison had said her presence was procedurally appropriate, and because, if she was honest, there was something she needed to see through. Vane opened the session with the formal language of record, date, participants, case designation, and then set the procedural language down and looked around the table. "Ms. Moya," he said, "thank you for coming." "I wasn't going to," she said. "Then I thought about the 8 people who filed the same report I filed, and I decided I was." In the quiet that followed that, Tran made a note. Ferris opened her folder. "Ms. Moya, I'd like you to walk us through the events of November 14th of last year, in your own words and at whatever pace is useful to you." Moya walked them through it. She was precise. She used dates, times, names where she had them, approximations where she didn't, and she flagged the difference clearly each time. She described Cole's conduct during a training rotation she'd attended as a lateral participant. She'd been cross-assigned from a medical transport unit for a 2-week refresher course. She described the comments about female capability in combat contexts, which she'd initially logged as the kind of ambient bias she'd navigated throughout her career. She described the moment it became something else. "He used me as a demonstration," she said. "Same as I understand he did with Lieutenant Bennett. The difference was that when I responded to his initial contact, I didn't..." She stopped, chose words carefully. "I was junior. I was cross-assigned, which meant I had no standing in this command, and I had been told explicitly by my own CO before the rotation that Commander Cole's training program had strong command support and that I should focus on the coursework and not make the assignment complicated. Her voice stayed level. So I absorbed it. I filed the complaint afterward because I thought the system was supposed to work. She looked at Walsh when she said that last sentence. Walsh looked at the table. The complaint was closed in 30 days, she said. I received a form response stating that the matter had been reviewed and no corrective action was warranted. No one interviewed me. No one asked me to clarify anything. A pause. I filed the secondary complaint with the IG's office because I didn't know what else to do. Then I heard nothing, and then I separated from service because I'd spent 17 years building something I believed in, and it turned out the building had a structural problem I hadn't accounted for. The room was quiet for a beat too long. "Thank you, Ms. Moya," Ferris said. Breck, Cole's attorney, said carefully, "Ms. Moya, I'd like to ask—" "You can ask," Moya said, "but I want to be clear that I'm not here to be cross-examined about my credibility. I'm here because I have a documented record, a case number, and 17 years of service that ended because a report I filed in good faith was processed as an inconvenience." She looked at him steadily. "So ask what you're going to ask." Breck recalculated visibly. He asked 3 procedural questions about the timing of her complaints, all of which she answered with specific dates, then closed his folder. It was at approximately 09:47 that the door to the conference room opened. Not knocked. Opened. The MP who came through it was senior petty officer rank, and the expression on her face was the particular expression of someone who had been told to interrupt something important and had decided that what she was carrying justified it. She looked at Vane. "Sir," she said, "there's an incident in the medical wing, post-surgical ward." Claire was out of her chair before the sentence finished. She moved fast through the corridor with the MP keeping pace beside her and Garrison somewhere behind trying to keep up. The medical wing was 200 meters from the admin block through a connecting corridor, and she covered it in slightly under 40 seconds and pushed through the ward doors into a scene that had the organized urgency of a situation that was 45 seconds from becoming worse. The nursing staff had formed a response cluster around room 112. Not Torres's room, one further down. She registered the room number, looked at the chart on the door that she'd memorized 3 mornings ago, and felt something go tight in her chest. Room 112, Daniel Moya. The ward nurse, Lieutenant Okafor, competent, the one who'd given her the full orientation when she'd arrived, came toward her immediately. "He's post-op day 4 from a splenic repair and right femur stabilization," Okafor said, dropping into clinical without preamble because she'd clearly clocked that Claire needed information, not management. "BP dropped 11 minutes ago. Heart rate is up, 118, and he's running a temp of 38.9 since 0600. We were monitoring, but it moved faster than the chart predicted. Labs from this morning? Hemoglobin is lower than yesterday's draw. His drain output overnight was, let me see him." She went in. Daniel Moya was 28, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who'd been fit before the injury reorganized his body's priorities. He was awake, which was both good and a problem because he was visibly working to maintain it. The specific tight focus of someone who knew something was wrong and was trying to stay present through it. "Lieutenant," he said. "Don't talk," she said, already at his vitals, reading the monitor. Heart rate 121 now. BP 94/60. Not catastrophic, but moving in a direction that had an endpoint. "When did the pain change?" "Hour ago," he said. "Maybe more. Felt different from before." "Different how?" "More interior. Like it was deeper." He stopped. "My sister. She's in the building," Claire said. "She's fine. Focus on me." She pressed lightly on his abdomen, below and to the left of the surgical site. His face changed immediately. Not dramatically, but the specific way faces changed when pressure found something that shouldn't be there. She straightened, looked at Okafor, who was in the doorway. "Get Dr. Reyes," she said. "Now, and I need a portable ultrasound in here in the next 4 minutes." "I'm on suspension," she started. "I know," Claire said. "Get Reyes." Okafor went. Claire looked at Daniel. He was watching her with the controlled attention of someone who'd been trained to assess situations and didn't like what he was assessing. "How bad?" he said. "You may be bleeding internally," she said, because he was 28 and a service member and he deserved the truth delivered without softening. "The repair may have a complication. We're going to find out in the next few minutes, and then we're going to fix it." "Maybe?" "The numbers are suggestive. The ultrasound will confirm." She checked his IV line. "Good placement, still patent." "Are you on blood thinners as part of your post-op protocol?" They said low-dose heparin. She looked at the medication chart on the wall, confirmed it, calculated what that meant for the scenario she was building in her head, which was still a hypothesis but was becoming less hypothetical by the minute. Dr. Reyes came through the door at a pace that said Okafor had communicated correctly. He was the senior surgical attending on the ward, early 50s, the efficient movements of someone who'd done his best thinking under pressure for 30 years. He looked at the monitor, looked at Claire, looked at the chart. "Suspicion?" he said. "Post-op hemorrhage, possible splenic rebleed, heparin complicating the picture. I want to see the drain output from overnight, and I want an abdominal ultrasound before we go anywhere else with this." "You're on suspension," he said, not accusatory, just noting a procedural fact. "I know." He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "Tell me what you see." She told him. Vital trend, pain location change, the way Daniel's face had responded to the abdominal pressure. The delta in this morning's hemoglobin versus yesterday's. Reyes listened without interrupting, which was the mark of someone who understood that information had a hierarchy and the hierarchy was not determined by rank. The ultrasound arrived. Reyes ran it himself, Claire at his shoulder, and the image that came up on the screen was not ambiguous. Free fluid in the abdomen. A collection at the surgical site larger than it should have been on post-op day 4. "Bleeding," Reyes said. "Yes." "Volume." "Enough." He straightened and looked at Daniel. "Mr. Moya, we're going to need to take you back to the OR. You have fluid accumulating around your surgical repair that needs to be addressed." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How soon?" "As soon as we can move you," Reyes said, "which is now." He looked at the nursing staff clustering in the doorway. "Get OR2 prepped. Get anesthesia on the phone. And somebody page surgical backup because I want Dr. Faria scrubbed in." He started moving, then stopped and looked at Claire. "Come." "I'm suspended." "You caught it," he said. "You're coming." He moved into the hallway and his voice carried back. "Somebody sort out the paperwork later." The hallway outside room 112 had acquired people in the last 8 minutes. Okafor was coordinating. 2 orderlies were positioning a transport gurney. Garrison had arrived from the admin block and was standing against the wall with the expression of someone who'd walked into a different kind of emergency than the one he was trained for. And Sandra Moya was standing at the end of the corridor. Nobody had told her. She'd followed anyway. She'd heard something in the conference room or felt it, or simply known the way siblings sometimes knew, and she'd walked out of the proceeding and down the corridor and arrived at the exact moment the transport gurney was rolling toward her brother's room. She saw Claire first. Claire met her eyes. There was a moment, just a beat, 2 seconds, where everything Sandra Moya had been holding together in that conference room showed itself in her face. The weight of it. 17 years. The report. The form letter. The separation. Her brother in a hospital. All of it surfacing at once in a face that had been so controlled for so long. "He's going to the OR," Claire said, keeping her voice even and direct because that was what the moment needed. "There's a complication with his repair that we caught early. Dr. Reyes is one of the best surgical attendings on this coast. They're moving now, which is the right call." Sandra's jaw tightened. "How serious?" "Serious enough to go back to the OR. Not so serious that we're behind the curve." "Is that the truth?" "Yes," Claire said. Sandra held her gaze for another second. Then she nodded, a single decisive motion, and stepped aside to let the gurney through. Daniel Moya, being wheeled past his sister, reached out and grabbed her hand for the 3 seconds it took the gurney to pass her. Neither of them said anything. Then his hand released and the gurney kept moving and Sandra stood in the corridor watching him go. with the expression of someone who understood that the hardest thing she could do right now was stay where she was and let other people do their jobs. Claire followed the gurney. Behind her, in the corridor, she heard Garrison's voice and then Ferris's. Ferris had come from the admin block too, and the sound of the two of them speaking in low, urgent tones was the sound of a proceeding that had just been involuntarily paused by something larger than itself. Or two took 11 minutes to prep, which was 4 minutes faster than standard, and said something about how Okafor had communicated the urgency. Anesthesia was in place by the time the gurney arrived. Dr. Faria, surgical backup, mid-40s, the compact, precise energy of someone who worked small and accurate, was already scrubbed when Claire came through the OR doors. She scrubbed in beside Reyes without ceremony. Her suspension was a documentation problem. Daniel Moya's abdomen was an immediate one. The procedure that followed was not clean or quick in the way that medical dramas suggested surgical procedures were. It was methodical and pressured and involved 2 moments where the bleeding site resisted identification and 1 moment where Reyes said something under his breath that wasn't suitable for documentation, and then found what he was looking for, and the room collectively released a tension it had been holding. Claire worked the left margin of the field while Reyes managed the primary site, and Faria handled irrigation. She said what needed to be said and not more. She handed instruments before they were asked for twice, which earned her a glance from Reyes that wasn't quite approval, but was in its neighborhood. The repair took 53 minutes. The rebleed was controlled. The site was stabilized. Daniel Moya's vitals normalized incrementally over the last 15 minutes of the procedure in the way that meant the body starting to believe the crisis was over. Reyes closed methodically. Nobody spoke much. The OR had its own specific silence. Not peaceful, not tense, just the focused absence of unnecessary sound that happened when skilled people were doing something that required everything they had. When it was done, Claire stepped back and stripped her gloves and stood at the edge of the OR for a moment, while Faria and the nursing staff completed the close and prepared for transport to recovery. Reyes pulled his mask down and looked at her. "You caught it at least 2 hours before the monitors would have escalated it," he said. "Maybe," she said. "The hemoglobin delta was visible this morning." "It was visible in retrospect," he said. "You made the call before the number was conclusive." She didn't say anything to that. He studied her for a moment. "Your suspension paperwork is going to be interesting reading," he said. "I'm putting my name on it." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said, with the mild firmness of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in being thanked for it. He walked out. Claire stood in the emptying OR for another 30 seconds. The shape of the day had been proceeding, testimony, emergency, surgery. All of it moving in the same direction, and none of it cleanly, none of it on a timeline that anyone had controlled or predicted. She thought about Pryor saying she had a habit of handling things alone she didn't need to handle alone. She thought about Torres saying you just have to be better than the argument. She thought about Sandra Moya's face in that corridor, the 3 seconds of her brother's hand, the single nod. She pulled off her surgical cap and walked out. Sandra Moya was in the recovery waiting area, which was a small room off the surgical corridor with 4 chairs and a window that looked at a concrete wall. She'd been there the whole time. Claire knew this without checking because it was simply what Sandra would have done. She looked up when Claire came in. "He's out," Claire said. "The repair held. They'll bring him to recovery in about 20 minutes, and you can see him after that." Sandra let out a breath that had been living in her chest for a long time. "Thank you," she said. Claire sat down in the chair across from her. Not because she had anything else to say. She'd said the important thing. But because the room was small and the chair was there and Sandra Moya had been alone in it for 53 minutes. They sat in silence for a moment. "The proceeding," Sandra said. "Does it still happen? After all this?" "Yes," Claire said. "It still happens." "And Cole?" Claire looked at the concrete wall through the window. She thought about Cole's attorney filing the footage suppression motion. She thought about what Vane had said. "We have enough." She thought about 8 complaints, 3 cross-command incidents, 1 woman who'd separated from the service she'd built her life around because the system had decided a form letter was sufficient. "He'll answer for it," she said. "You sound sure." "I'm not sure about most things," Claire said. "That one I am." Sandra was quiet. Then, the technique you used on him, the takedown. She paused. Someone told me it took under 2 seconds. Closer to 2 than not. Sandra looked at her. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. I wish I'd known how to do that 14 months ago. I know, Claire said. The recovery room intercom clicked. A nurse's voice, calm and efficient. Dr. Reyes, OR2, recovery transfer. Moya, Daniel, ready for patient family. Sandra. Moya stood up, straightened her jacket, took one breath. She walked out. Claire stayed in the chair for another moment, alone in the small room with the concrete wall view, and heard from somewhere down the administrative corridor the sound of boots. Not the soft movement of medical staff, the deliberate, purposeful sound of multiple people moving with intention. She stood. Through the recovery waiting room's interior window, the one that looked into the surgical corridor, she saw General Vane walking past, Colonel Ferris beside him, and between them, 2 MPs she hadn't seen before. They weren't heading toward the medical wing. They were heading toward the residence block, toward Commander Cole's quarters. And behind them, visible for just a second before the group turned the corner, was a 4th figure in civilian clothes that Claire recognized from the sedan that had arrived the previous afternoon. Not Keyes, not Tran, but the 3rd federal presence who'd never been introduced, who'd sat in the back of the conference room and said nothing and written everything down. She was carrying an arrest warrant. Claire moved into the corridor before she'd made a conscious decision to do it, not to follow the group. Ferris had been clear about staying out of Cole's direct path, and Claire understood that the arrest, if that was what the warrant meant, needed to happen without any additional variables attached to it. But she moved because staying still in a small room waiting for information had a ceiling, and she'd hit it. She went to the nurse's station at the end of the surgical corridor instead. Okafor was there finishing the transfer documentation for Daniel Moya's recovery handoff. She looked up when Claire appeared. "He's stable," Okafor said preemptively. "I know. I was in the OR." Claire leaned against the counter. "What's happening in the admin block?" Okafor's expression said she knew more than her professional position strictly required her to know, which was true of most competent ward nurses in any closed institutional environment. MPS went through about 12 minutes ago, 2 different groups, one toward the residence block, one toward Captain Walsh's office. Walsh too. That was the thing Claire hadn't been certain of until now. "Thank you," she said. "Dr. Reyes already put a note in the system," Okafor said. "About the OR this morning. Your involvement." She paused. "I added mine." Claire looked at her. "You caught it," Okafor said simply. "That goes in the record." The arrest, if arrest was precisely the right word, which legally it wasn't yet. The warrant being for detention pending formal charges rather than criminal arrest, a distinction that Garrison would explain to her in careful detail later, happened at 1019 in the residence block's 2nd floor corridor. Claire wasn't there. She knew the shape of it from Garrison's account, from the MP report she was shown 2 days later, and from Damian Ruiz, who had been walking toward the block to deliver administrative paperwork and had the particular fortune or misfortune of being in exactly the right place at the wrong time. Cole had been in his quarters. He'd been there since the morning, which suggested either that Breck, his attorney, had told him to stay put, or that he'd correctly read the temperature of the facility and made the calculation that the residence block was safer than anywhere with witnesses. He opened the door on the 3rd knock, which meant he wasn't surprised, which meant some part of him had been waiting. He was still in uniform. That was the detail Ruiz kept returning to when he described it later. That Cole had been in full dress, not off-duty clothes, as if he'd put on his rank that morning as a defense mechanism and hadn't been able to take it off. The federal agent, whose name was Lana Cardwell, DODIG Criminal Investigations Division, a fact that emerged over the following hours, presented the detention warrant without preamble. 2 MPs flanked the doorway. Ferris stood back and let Cardwell manage the procedural components because this was Cardwell's jurisdiction and everyone in the hallway knew it. Cole read the warrant. His face, by Ruiz's account, did not fall dramatically. It closed, the way a blast door closed. Not with fear, but with the mechanical finality of something that had been engineered for exactly this moment. and was finally executing its single function. He said, "I want to call my attorney." "You can do that from the JAG conference room," Cardwell said. "Your attorney has already been notified of the detention." Cole said nothing else. He walked out of his quarters between the MPs without being directed to, which was the last exercise of self-direction he would have for some time, and the door to his room stayed open behind him because no one had thought to close it. And Ruiz stood in the corridor watching the group move away and thought about the training hall 2 days ago and the sound of a palm connecting with a woman's face in front of 47 people who'd done nothing. He closed Cole's door himself, stood there for a second. Then he went back to deliver the paperwork he'd been carrying and didn't tell anyone what he'd seen for 3 hours. And then he told everyone. Walsh's situation was procedurally different and in some ways worse. He wasn't detained. He was placed on administrative leave pending the IG investigation, which meant he retained his rank and his quarters and his access to his attorney, but lost his command authority as of 1100 that morning, effective immediately, which in practice meant every decision that had flowed through his desk for the preceding 8 months was now subject to review, and every person he'd supervised was now a potential witness rather than a subordinate. The command authority transferred temporarily to the executive officer, Commander Patricia Ashby, who had been Walsh's second-in-command for 14 months, and who received the news of her provisional command with the controlled, slightly stunned expression of someone who'd been preparing for a different kind of Tuesday. Ashby's first official act as acting CO was to reinstate Claire's duty status. She did this without ceremony, by memo, at 11:45, and the memo's language was professional and unremarkable. Duty suspension lifted pending completion of administrative review, all prior restrictions rescinded. And yet when Garrison delivered a copy to Claire in the recovery waiting area where she'd gone back to sit with Sandra Moya while Daniel was brought up to his room, the plainness of the language somehow made it land harder than something more formal would have. "That's it?" Sandra said, reading the memo over Claire's shoulder. "That's it," Garrison said. "Legally, she's fully reinstated as of the timestamp." Sandra looked at Claire. "How do you feel?" Claire thought about that. "The same," she said, which was true. The memo changed her documentation, not her. She'd been the same person suspended as she was reinstated, just as she'd been the same person before the training hall as after it. The institution's paperwork catching up to reality had never been the thing that mattered to her. What mattered was what she could do while holding it. She folded the memo and put it in her jacket pocket. "I'm going to check Daniel's recovery vitals," she said. "You should go be with him." Sandra went. Garrison stayed for a moment, looking at the space where both women had been. "Do you ever he started, then stopped. "What?" "Get angry?" he said. "About any of it. The process. How long it takes. How much it costs people." Claire considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. "Not the way it shows in movies, but yes." "What does it look like when you do?" She thought about the moment in the training hall, the heat in her cheek, the calculation that had followed it, the deliberate choice of how much force and exactly where. "Like a decision," she said. Garrison processed that. He was going to be a good attorney in 10 years. Right now he was still too interested in the edges of things, which was actually why he was going to be good. "Go file your notes," she told him. "Everything from the OR this morning needs to be in the record today." He went. By early afternoon, the facility had reorganized itself around the new center of gravity the way institutions always did, absorbing the disruption, routing around the absence of the removed authority, the remaining personnel recalibrating to the adjusted hierarchy with a speed that would have been cynical if it weren't also simply how institutions survived. Red Harbor had a mission regardless of who was running it. The mission didn't pause for administrative collapse. Claire worked the post-surgical ward for 4 hours starting at 1300, and it was the most useful she'd felt in 3 days. Real work, the kind with clear problems and concrete actions and feedback that came in the form of improved numbers on a monitor rather than the slow accumulation of institutional momentum. She changed dressings, reviewed discharge criteria for 2 recovering patients, consulted on a pain management protocol that the overnight staff had flagged as potentially underdosed, and spent 20 minutes talking to Torres about his physical therapy timeline, which he was approaching with the specific stubborn optimism of someone who hadn't yet been beaten down enough to calibrate his expectations. They said 8 weeks, Torres said. I'm going to do it in 6. They said 8 weeks because 6 is the floor for your particular repair, Claire said. If you push the floor, you extend the ceiling. That sounds like something you'd put on a motivational poster. It sounds like biomechanics, she said, which it is. He grinned. He was doing better. The color was better. The posture in the bed was better. The particular loosening that happened when pain became manageable rather than constant. People are talking about you, he said. The whole ward. I know. Good talking, he said. Not gossip. More like, he searched for it, like when something happens and people need to say it out loud to believe it happened. She straightened his IV line, even though it didn't need straightening. Focus on 6 weeks, she said. The formal expansion of the investigation became official at 1600, when Keyes from the DODIG's office convened a brief with Vane, Ferris, and the newly installed acting CO Ashby. Claire was not in that meeting. She knew about it because Garrison called her at 1612 from the hallway outside it, speaking quietly. They're expanding the scope, he said. Not just Cole, not just Walsh. They've identified 2 other commands where Cole held training authority in the past 6 years, and they've opened a parallel review of how the complaint processing pipeline handled incoming reports in all 3. How many complaints total? Across all 3 commands? A pause. 14. That they found. Cardwell thinks there are more that were never formally logged. 14. The number sat in Claire's chest with a specific weight. Not surprised, she'd understood the shape of this since Vane's phone call 2 nights ago. But the difference between understanding a shape and seeing its dimensions was real. What does that mean for Cole's timeline? She said. The detention extends. They're looking at formal charges within 72 hours. Multiple counts of conduct unbecoming, abuse of authority, potentially Article 93 violations under UCMJ, cruelty and maltreatment. Garrison paused. And Walsh is looking at dereliction of duty for the complaint suppression. Potentially more, depending on what the command records show. Is Breck still his attorney? Cole's? Yes. Though the word is Breck didn't know about the cross-command history when he took the case, and he's had a very educational last 6 hours. Claire stood in the ward corridor, her back to the wall, watching Okafor hand off to the incoming evening shift. What do you need from me? Statement, Garrison said. Full account, start to finish, on record. Ferris wants it done tonight while everything is current. Can you come to the JAG office at 1900? Yes. Claire. First time he'd used her name rather than her rank. He caught it, recalibrated. Lieutenant, what happened in the OR this morning? Reyes's note is in the system, Okafor's is in the system. That matters. The suspension was active when you responded. I know. Ashby's memo reinstates you effective 11:45, but the OR call was at 09:40. There's a 2-hour gap. I know, she said again. I made the call I needed to make. I'm not criticizing it, he said quickly. I'm telling you because it's going to come up in the statement, and the way you explain it matters. She thought about Reyes in the OR doorway, telling her to come without ceremony, about Okafor filing her own note, about Daniel Moya's vitals stabilizing over the last 15 minutes of the procedure. I'll explain it honestly, she said. That's usually enough. A beat. Right, Garrison said. 1900. She arrived at the JAG office at 1855 and gave the statement over the following 90 minutes, start to finish, to Garrison, and a second JAG officer named Lieutenant Commander Wells, who asked the clarifying questions while Garrison managed the documentation. She described the training hall in sequence, the noise in the corridor, the decision to enter, Cole's progression through the session, the physical contact, her response. She described the suspension, Ferris's instructions, Pryor's call, Vane's call, the 5 vehicles, the conference room. She described Daniel Moya's room and what she saw in his vitals and what she did about it. When she got to the OR gap, she described that too. At the time you responded to the medical situation, Wells said, you were under active duty suspension. Yes. You proceeded anyway. I assessed the situation, formed a clinical opinion that the patient was at risk of a serious hemorrhagic complication, and communicated that to the senior attending on duty. Dr. Reyes made the decision to proceed and requested my assistance. I assisted. You could have communicated your assessment and stepped back. I could have, she said. The clinical picture was moving faster than a handoff would have allowed, and I had information that Reyes needed in real time. Stepping back in that moment would have prioritized my administrative status over patient care, and that was acceptable to you. No, she said. It was necessary. Acceptable implies a comfortable choice. It wasn't comfortable. It was the right call in a situation where the right call wasn't clean. Wells looked at her for a moment, made a note. Thank you, Lieutenant, she said. Dump. The statement ran until 2045. By then, the facility had shifted into its late evening register. Quieter, the day staff gone. The skeleton crew maintaining the ongoing work of a medical facility that didn't close. Claire walked back through the connecting corridor toward the medical wing. Not because her shift extended to this hour, but because she needed to check Daniel's evening labs before she was willing to consider the day finished. His numbers were good. Better than good for post-op day 4 with a re-bleed intervention. His hemoglobin was recovering, his BP had been stable since 1400, and the drain output was within normal range. The surgical repair was holding. She stood outside his room for a moment and looked through the observation window. He was asleep. Sandra was in the chair beside his bed, not asleep, reading something on her phone, her posture the loose vigilance of someone who'd been on high alert for days and was finally allowing herself to settle into a lower register without fully releasing it. Claire watched for a moment, then walked on. She was nearly at the exit when her phone rang. Vane. She answered. Long day, he said. Yes. Daniel Moya is stable? Yes, I checked 20 minutes ago. Good. A pause. Not an empty one. The kind of pause that meant he was measuring something. I want to give you an update on the formal proceedings. Garrison briefed me at 1600. This is more recent than that. Another pause. Cole met with Breck at 1800. Breck presented him with the full scope of the investigation. All 3 commands, 14 complaints, the IG's expanded review. Cole's been sitting in the JAG holding facility since the detention this morning, and up until 1800 he'd been maintaining the position that the training hall incident was mischaracterized, and that the prior complaints were standard personnel friction. Claire waited. At approximately 1930, Vane said, Cole requested to speak to Cardwell without his attorney present. The corridor was very quiet. He's cooperating? She said. He gave a statement, Vane said. We're still reviewing it, but yes, he's cooperating. A beat. The statement implicates Walsh more substantially than our existing documentation does. It appears Walsh didn't just fail to act on the complaints. He actively advised Cole to modify his behavior in ways that would make future complaints harder to document, not to stop the behavior, but to restructure it. Claire was quiet for a moment. That changes Walsh's exposure significantly, she said. Considerably, Vane agreed. She leaned against the corridor wall. The exit was 6 feet away and she was suddenly not in a hurry to go through it. Why is he cooperating? Hard to say from the outside. Breck fought it, Cole insisted. A pause. My read, and I've been doing this for a long time, is that he got into that room alone and realized he was the only one left who didn't know what everyone else already knew. That's a specific kind of isolation. Some people double down in it. Some people decide they're done. He hit a nurse in front of 47 people, Claire said. The doubling down was already done. Yes, Vane said. It was. He paused. There's one more thing. In Cole's statement, when he was asked why he chose you specifically for the demonstration, knowing or not knowing your background, his answer was that you looked like someone who wouldn't fight back. The thing in Claire's chest went very quiet. That was his criterion, Vane continued, for every instance. Across all 3 commands, he selected people who looked like they wouldn't fight back. She stood with that for a long moment. The 14 complaints, she said, all selected on that basis. It appears so. Then the 14 isn't the real number, she said. Those are the people who fought back enough to file a report. Silence. No, Vane said. It isn't the real number. She pushed off the wall, stood in the center of the corridor with the exit ahead and the ward behind. Get some sleep, Vane said. Tomorrow is going to be operational. What happens tomorrow? The formal charges are filed at 0800. That's when it becomes public record. Cole, Walsh, the expanded investigation. It goes into the official proceedings and it stops being containable. He paused. Red Harbor is a significant facility with high visibility. This is going to move. Okay, she said. There will be media interest, he said. Your name will appear in the record as the triggering incident. I want you to know that before it happens. I understand. Do you want a communications officer assigned? No, she said. A beat. He didn't push. Good night, Lieutenant. The call ended. She stood in the corridor for another moment, then walked out into the cold March dark and back toward the residence block. The 5 vehicles in the front approach had been joined by 2 more during the course of the day, and the additional vehicles had the different configuration she associated with press, though she wasn't certain yet. She noted it, kept walking. Her room was the same room it had been when she'd left it at 04:30 that morning. Small desk, narrow bed, window with a partial view of the north grounds. She sat on the edge of the bed and went through the day in the clinical way she always reviewed complex situations. Not emotionally, but structurally, checking what had been done against what had needed to be done, identifying the gaps in the decisions and the places where things had moved wrong before moving right. Cole's criterion. She looked like someone who wouldn't fight back. She thought about Sandra Moya in the conference room, hands folded on the table, saying, I filed the complaint because I thought the system was supposed to work. 17 years of service, a form letter, a separation that didn't need to happen. She thought about the 14. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep quickly, but she slept. At 6:47 the following morning, 20 minutes before Vane had scheduled the charges to be filed, Garrison called her. She was already awake, already dressed, sitting at the small desk with coffee that had gone lukewarm. There's a problem, he said. His voice had the particular tightness of someone who'd been handed new information and not finished processing it. What kind? Cole's statement last night, Garrison said. The part where he implicated Walsh in structuring the complaint process. Cardwell's team started pulling the command records this morning to verify it. A pause. The records from the 18 months before Walsh were also pulled as a baseline comparison. And? The complaint processing practices that Walsh advised Cole to work around, Garrison said. They didn't originate with Walsh. Claire set down the coffee. Walsh inherited them, Garrison said, from his predecessor, who inherited them from his. The IG team is looking at a documented pattern in this command's complaint processing that goes back at least 11 years and 3 commanding officers. The morning light through the window was gray and flat and very still. Cole knew, Garrison said. He knew when he arrived at Red Harbor that the complaint pipeline here was managed. That's not in his statement. That's in the command records. But it means that what happened to Sandra Moya and the others wasn't an accident of one bad actor with one compliant CO. It was an environment that had been built over a decade to function exactly the way it functioned. Claire was quiet. The charges at 0800 are still filing, Garrison said. Cole, Walsh, those proceed. But Cardwell is escalating the scope again. She's calling her office in an hour. This isn't one command's investigation anymore. He stopped. Claire, he said, the records they found this morning in the 11-year pattern. A pause. There are 31 complaints. She stood up from the desk. 31, he said again, that we can document. Through her window in the front approach, one of the vehicles she'd assessed as possible press had its door open and a woman was stepping out with a camera. Not possible press, definite press. I'll be at the JAG office at 0730, Claire said, before the 0800 filing. That's 30 minutes from now. I know, she said. Start without me if you need to. I have one stop first. She ended the call, pulled on her jacket, walked out of the residence block and across the facility to the medical wing, Because she needed to check Daniel Moya's morning labs before the day became what it was going to become. And because there was a question she'd been sitting with since Vane's call the previous evening that had sharpened overnight into something she needed to say out loud to someone who would understand the weight of it. Sandra Moya was in the corridor outside Daniel's room. She'd clearly been there since early, the carry-on bag from the previous day stowed against the wall beside her. She looked up when Claire came around the corner. "Morning labs are good," Claire said. "I just pulled them. He's trending well." Sandra let out a breath. "Thank you." Claire stopped in front of her, looked at her directly. 31, she said. "That's the number they found this morning. 11 years. Sandra went very still. "I wanted you to know before it's in the public record," Claire said. "Because you were one of them. Because you flew here. Because you sat in that room and said it out loud." She paused. "And because it matters that you know you weren't alone in it, even when the system was telling you that you were." Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her face that was not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but the complicated third thing that happened when both existed at once, and you were too tired to keep them separate. "What happens now?" she said. Claire thought about the vehicles in the front approach, the charges filing in 70 minutes, Cardwell on the phone to her office. The 11 years of records that a command had assumed were contained and had turned out to be evidence. "Now it gets loud," she said, "and then it gets done." Sandra nodded once. Claire turned toward the JAG office. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard it, a shift in the facility's ambient sound, the particular change in collective attention that happened when something moved from inside to outside an institution's walls. She stopped, looked toward the main entrance, visible from this angle through the connecting corridor's far window. The press vehicle had been joined by 3 more, and standing at the facility's main entrance, being escorted in by 2 MPs, was a figure in civilian clothes that Claire didn't recognize, but whose posture and the camera crew behind her communicated exactly what she was. A journalist. With access. Which meant someone had given her access. Which meant the story was no longer Red Harbor's to manage. Claire looked at the entrance for 2 more seconds, processing that. Then she looked at the JAG office doorway 30 meters ahead. She walked toward it. Behind her, the facility's main entrance opened again. And this time, the figure coming through it wasn't press. It was Cole's attorney, Breck, and he was moving fast, and his face was the face of a man who had just received information that had changed the shape of everything he'd agreed to defend, and who was now walking toward the JAG conference room to have a conversation that Claire suspected would end the last negotiable element of Commander Ethan Cole's career. She pushed through the JAG office door. Garrison looked up from a table covered in documents. "They're here," she said. "I know," he said. "All of it?" "All of it," she said. "Let's finish this." The documents on Garrison's table were organized by command and by year, and the years went back further than Claire had expected, even after his phone call. 11 years on paper, probably longer in practice, because the practices that built complaint suppression pipelines didn't emerge fully formed. They grew from smaller accommodations, individual decisions to look the other way, institutional habits that calcified gradually into something that functioned like policy without ever being written down as one. She sat across from Garrison and Wells, and they went through what Cardwell's team had found. 31 documented complaints across 3 commanding officers. Of those, 26 had been closed without formal investigation. 3 had resulted in informal counseling sessions with no documented outcomes. 2 had been referred upward and subsequently lost in the transfer of administrative files, the same mechanism that had swallowed Sandra Moya's secondary complaint. Of the 31 people who'd filed, 9 had separated from service within 18 months of their filing date. 6 of those 9 had cited hostile work environment in their separation paperwork. The other 3 had cited personal reasons, which was the language people used when the real language wasn't safe. The charges filing at 0800 cover Cole and Walsh, Wells said. The expanded investigation into the command pattern is a separate track. That's Cardwell's jurisdiction, and it's going to run considerably longer than this week. How long? Claire said. Months, potentially. It depends on what the records from the predecessor commands show, and how cooperative those former COs are. Wells looked at her over the folder she was holding. Your role in the expanded investigation will be limited. You're the triggering incident. You're not a pattern victim. I know. But your testimony, the use of force incident, the sequence leading to it, establishes the behavioral baseline for Cole that the prior complaints corroborate. Breck understands that now, which is why she glanced at her watch. He's currently in the conference room down the hall, having a conversation with Cardwell that I expect will significantly alter his client's legal strategy. He's going to advise Cole to take a deal, Claire said. He's going to advise Cole that a deal is the only remaining option, Wells said. Those are different things. One is a recommendation, the other is a map with one road on it. The 0800 charges filed on schedule. Claire wasn't in the room when it happened. She was in the JAG office, finishing her formal statement addendum, the one that addressed the OR gap, and the decision she'd made at 0940 the previous morning. She wrote it the way she'd told Garrison she would, honestly, without softening the timeline or the fact that her suspension had been active, and without apologizing for the call itself. Garrison read it, made one small structural suggestion, and filed it without further comment. At 0812, Vane sent her a text. 2 words. It's filed. She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, thanked Wells, picked up her jacket, and went to the ward. The charges becoming public record happened the way Vane had said it would, quickly, and with a reach that Red Harbor's walls couldn't contain. By 1,000, the press vehicles in the front approach had doubled. By 1100, the facility's communications officer had issued a statement confirming that formal proceedings were underway and that the command was cooperating fully with the DoD Inspector General's investigation, which was true in the way that things were true when the alternative was considerably worse. Commander Patricia Ashby held a brief internal address for facility staff at 10:30. Not a press conference, just the people who worked there, in the main briefing room. Claire went. She stood near the back. Ashby was not a natural orator. She was a capable administrator who communicated in complete sentences and didn't embellish, and right now that was exactly right. This command has had a systemic failure, Ashby said to the 60-odd personnel in the room. I'm not going to characterize it differently than that. People came forward, reports were filed, and the institutional response was inadequate for years. That is a fact. The investigation will establish the full scope of that failure and the appropriate consequences for those responsible. She paused. What I want you to take from this morning is that the process is now working the way it was supposed to work all along. That doesn't undo what happened, but it is where we are, and it's where we go from. She looked around the room. If any of you have information relevant to the investigation, you contact Cardwell's office directly. Her contact information was distributed this morning. You do not route it through this command's administrative office. You go directly. Another pause. That's all. She walked out. The room held its quiet for a beat, and then it broke into the particular sound of people who had things to say to each other that they'd been carrying quietly for a long time. Ruiz found Claire near the door. He looked like he hadn't slept much. 31, he said. Yes. I've been at this facility for 2 years, he said. He was 23, she remembered. 2 years out of training, still in the part of his career where he was matching what he'd been told to expect against what things actually were. I didn't know. Most people didn't, she said. Should I have? She thought about that honestly. You knew what you saw in front of you, she said. You stamped my paperwork without asking about the black lines. That was the right call. He looked at her. That's not really an answer. No, she said. It isn't. She looked toward the front of the room, where a few people were still talking in clusters. The answer is that systems like this are built specifically so that individual people can't see the whole of them. Any given person only sees their piece. That's not an accident. It's the design. She paused. What matters now is what you do with the whole picture. He thought about that. Nodded, slowly, the nod of someone filing something away. She left him there and went back to the ward. The formal consequences for Colin Walsh moved through the military justice system with the focused efficiency of a process that had been thoroughly prepared and was no longer encountering resistance. Breck's conversation with Cardwell on the morning of the filings had produced exactly what Wells predicted: a restructured legal strategy that replaced denial with controlled cooperation, which was the language attorneys used when they meant their client had run out of other options and had decided to stop paying for the illusion of them. Cole entered a formal agreement with the investigating authority 10 days after his detention. The agreement acknowledged the conduct across all three commands. It acknowledged the physical assault in Training Hall B. It acknowledged the pattern of discriminatory conduct targeting personnel he had identified as unlikely to resist effectively. That language, unlikely to resist effectively, appeared in the official record and stayed there. And it said everything about his methodology that his 20-year service record had concealed. His rank was stripped. His retirement benefits were reviewed under the misconduct provisions and reduced substantially. He was formally separated from military service under conditions that would follow his record permanently. The separation was not quiet. The charges were public record. The IG's report would be public record. And the press that had arrived at Red Harbor's front approach on that March morning had done what press did with public records. Walsh's disposition took longer. The dereliction charges and the additional counts related to active complaint suppression carried greater complexity, more documentation, more legal negotiation. He was placed on indefinite administrative suspension while the proceedings ran. His command career was over regardless of the final resolution. Everyone who mattered understood that, including Walsh himself, who by the third week had stopped fighting the process and started the quieter work of managing what remained. 3 of the prior commanding officers identified in the 11-year pattern were contacted by the IG's office. 2 cooperated with the review. 1 retained an attorney and said nothing, which was itself information that went into the record. None of this was clean. None of it happened on a tidy timeline. The investigation would run for another 4 months before its formal report was issued, and the report would be thorough and damaging and would result in command-level reforms at Red Harbor and the 2 other affected facilities that would take years to fully implement and would still be imperfect in their implementation, because that was the nature of institutional change. It moved slowly, it moved unevenly, and it required constant pressure to sustain, but it moved. Sandra Moya stayed in Ashport for 11 days until Daniel was cleared for transport and could be moved to a rehabilitation facility closer to where she lived. In that time, she gave a formal statement to Cardwell's office, submitted her documentation from the original complaint and the secondary IG filing, and identified 2 other women from her original training cohort who had experienced similar conduct and had not filed, one of whom, when Sandra contacted her, said she'd been waiting for 2 years for someone else to go first. On her last morning at Red Harbor, Sandra stopped by the ward before the transport vehicle arrived. Claire was in the middle of a wound assessment on a patient in room 109, and Okafor came to the doorway and said simply, "Moya's leaving. She's in the corridor." Claire finished the assessment. She didn't rush it, because the patient was the priority and Sandra would wait 30 seconds, and then walked out. Sandra was in the corridor with her carry-on. Daniel was beside her in a wheelchair, cleared for discharge, looking significantly better than he had 6 days ago when Claire had stood in his room and pressed on his abdomen and watched his face change. He looked at her. "You saved my life," he said. Straightforward, no ceremony. "Dr. Reyes operated," she said. "I know who caught it," he said. She looked at him and at his sister and thought about what to say that was true and not inflated. "You would have made it," she said. "Probably. The margin was real, but not zero." She paused. "I just made sure the margin worked in your direction." Sandra almost smiled. "That's an interesting way to put it." "It's an accurate one." Sandra held out her hand. Claire shook it. Not a long moment. Sandra wasn't built for long moments right now, and neither was Claire, and they both understood that about each other. "The report is going to matter," Sandra said. "What they found. The 31. "Yes." "I need it to matter more than it mattered for us," Sandra said. "The people who come after." "It will," Claire said. And then, because Sandra was someone who'd earned honesty rather than comfort, "Not perfectly, not fast enough, but it will matter." Sandra nodded, wheeled her brother toward the exit. Claire watched them go and then went back to room 109 to finish her notes. The formal review of Claire's conduct, the use of force incident, The duty suspension, the OR intervention during the suspension gap, concluded in the third week of March. The review board consisted of 3 senior officers, none of whom were affiliated with Red Harbor, which was standard for cases involving command-level misconduct to ensure clean separation. They reviewed the security footage, the witness statements, the medical documentation from the OR, Reyes's note, Okafor's note, Claire's own statement, and a classified file annex that covered her prior service background and required 2 of the 3 board members to hold specific clearance levels to access. The board convened for a single day. Their findings took less time to reach than anyone had told her to expect. She was cleared on every count. The use of force was found to be proportional and appropriate given the documented provocation. The OR intervention was found to be consistent with her duty obligations as a medical professional in a situation where patient welfare was immediately at risk and the senior attending on duty had explicitly requested her assistance. And the board noted that the existing suspension pertained to administrative duty status rather than professional medical responsibility, a distinction the documentation supported. The finding on the OR gap was not a clean acquittal. The board noted that the suspension had been procedurally valid and that operating under it had carried institutional risk, but they found that the institutional risk was outweighed by the clinical necessity and that the outcome, a patient's life preserved, was the appropriate measure of the decision. Garrison called her when the findings came through. She was in the break room at the end of the day shift, eating something that had been in the refrigerator long enough that she didn't fully want to think about its origins. "Cleared," he said. "Full record notation. Commendation recommended for the medical intervention." She put down the food. "Recommended by the board," he said. "It has to go through Ashby's office for formal issuance, but the recommendation is in the findings." "Okay," she said. A pause. "Is that it?" he said. "Just okay?" She thought about what she was actually feeling and found it was not triumphant and not relieved in the simple way that words suggested. It was something quieter, the particular stillness of a long tension releasing, not dramatically but completely, like a rope going slack after it's been pulled at both ends for too long. "What would you like me to say?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "Something. You've been at the center of something significant for 3 weeks." "I was at the center of a training hall for 2 seconds," she said. "The significance was already there. I just made it visible." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to remember that," he said, "for a while." "Good," she said. "Go home, Garrison." Master Chief Pryor found her 3 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon, in the small courtyard on the facility's east side where she'd taken to eating lunch when the weather allowed. He sat down across from her without asking, which was the first time he'd done that, and looked at her with the direct, assessing expression she'd noticed the first time she'd seen him in the training hall. "You doing all right?" he said. "Yes." Honest answer or polite one? She thought about it. "Mostly honest." He nodded. "The recommendation for commendation came through Ashby's desk this morning," he said. "She signed it. Garrison told me. It's going in your record with full notation." He paused. "I also want you to know that I submitted a statement to the IG's office about my 2 prior complaints from when I put things in writing and nothing happened." He said it plainly, without drama. "It should have been in the record 3 years ago. It's in there now." Claire looked at him. There was something she'd wanted to understand about Pryor since the first moment in the training hall. The quality of his stillness, the fact that he'd recognized her immediately and said nothing, the measured way he'd moved through everything that followed. "You knew what you were looking at," she said, "in the training hall, from the first minute. I recognized a technique in your posture before Cole even squared up," he said. "You hold your weight differently than medical personnel. You monitor exits. You track everyone in the room." He paused. "I've seen that in exactly one context." "And you said his name twice," she said. "Cole, quietly. You tried to stop it before it started." "I did." His jaw tightened slightly, the only external evidence of something he was clearly not going to develop further right now. "I should have done more than say his name quietly." She looked at him for a moment. "You filed reports," she said, "twice. And they went nowhere." "They went somewhere now," she said. They're in Cardwell's record. They're part of the 31. He looked at the courtyard. The light was thin and pale, the kind of March light that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to become spring. 31, he said. And more that weren't documented, she said. The ones who didn't file because they were watching what happened to the ones who did. He was quiet for a moment. What do you do with that? He said. Not rhetorically, genuinely asking. She thought about Torres, who was 3 weeks into physical therapy and running one day ahead of his projected timeline and refusing to acknowledge what that said about his projections. She thought about Daniel Moya's morning labs, stable and improving, the repair holding. She thought about Sandra saying, I need it to matter more than it mattered for us. You do what you can do, she said, in the position you're in, with what you have right now, and you accept that some of the things you're fixing are things you should have fixed earlier, and that the accepting doesn't erase the delay, but it also doesn't have to define everything that comes after. Pryor looked at her. That's not as satisfying as an answer as it should be, she said. No, he said, but it's the right one. He stood up, extended his hand. It was an honor to serve with you, Lieutenant, even briefly. She shook it. Thank you for the report, Master Chief. Both of them. He walked back inside. She sat in the thin March light and finished her lunch. No. Vane called on a Thursday evening in late March, 3 weeks after the charges had filed and 10 days after the board's findings. She was in her permanent quarters by then. The temporary housing block assignment had been resolved in the second week, and she had a room that was slightly larger and had a window that looked at something other than a concrete wall. The IG's preliminary findings are going to be released next week, he said. Public summary. The full report comes later. I know, Cardwell's office notified me. There's a recommendation in the preliminary findings, he said, for a new position, Joint Advisory, JSOC, and Naval Medical, specifically focused on training standards and conduct review processes across medical-adjacent commands. A pause. You're named in the recommendation. She was quiet for a moment. As what? As a potential consultant, non-operational. You'd be advising on training culture, not running missions. He paused. It's voluntary. It's outside your current assignment, and I want to be clear that it's not connected to your clearance status or any prior classification. This would be a new role with its own parameters. She looked at the window. The north grounds were dark, but there was a light on in the residence block across the way, and she could see from this distance the shape of someone moving in it. Just a shadow, someone's evening, something ordinary and ongoing. Why me? She said. Because you walked into a training hall for the right reason and responded to what you found there, Vane said. Not for career positioning, not for visibility, because the noise was affecting patient care and you made a decision. He paused. That's the profile the recommendation calls for. She sat with it. The honest version of sitting with it, which meant acknowledging the part of her that wanted to say no on reflex because saying yes meant more visibility, and she'd built her current life specifically around the quieter register, and acknowledging that the reflex was real but wasn't automatically right. 31, the ones who didn't file. Sandra sitting in a chair for 53 minutes while her brother was in surgery. Moya's hand on the form letter, the predecessor commanding officers and the 11 years, and the practices that built themselves into something structural because no one had been in a position to see the hole and push back against it. Send me the parameters, she said. I'll review them. That's all I'm asking, Vane said. It wasn't quite. They both knew that. But it was where the conversation was tonight, and tonight was the right size for it. Bob. On the last Friday in March, 3 weeks and 4 days after Claire Bennett had walked through Red Harbor Naval Medical Center's front door with a transfer packet and a duffel bag and a service record with more black lines than readable text, she was sitting in Torres's room when he did something with his leg that the physical therapy schedule said he wasn't supposed to be able to do for another 9 days. He looked at his leg, looked at her, looked back at his leg. That's not supposed to happen yet, he said. No, she agreed. I'm ahead of schedule. You are, he grinned, which still pulled at something in his side and which he had long since stopped letting stop him. Did I not tell you 6 weeks? You told me 6 weeks, she said. The physiology disagreed. The physiology came around, he said. He settled back against the pillow, pleased in the uncomplicated way of someone who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of good news. "Hey, Lieutenant." "What?" "People are going to keep asking you about the training hall," he said. "For a while. You know that, right?" "I know." "What are you going to tell them?" She thought about it. What was actually true, stripped of everything that had been added to it in 3 weeks of proceedings and documentation and press vehicles and 31 names in 11 years, and the particular institutional weight of things that had been wrong for so long, they'd started to look like they were just the way things were. "I walked into a room," she said. "I responded to what was in it. That's all." Torres looked at her. "That's not all?" he said, with the confident clarity of someone 24 years old who was still close enough to things to see them plainly. "That's never all. That's just the part that fits in a sentence." She looked at him. He was right. The part that fit in a sentence was, she'd walked in and she'd acted and things had changed. The part that didn't fit was everything those 2 seconds had opened. Not because she'd planned it that way, not because she'd arrived at Red Harbor Naval Medical Center with the intention of breaking something open, but because she'd done what her training and her experience and her own stubborn refusal to perform smallness had made her do. And it had turned out that doing that one thing in that one room had been exactly what 31 accumulated silences had needed someone to do. That was the thing about silence. It wasn't neutral. It had weight, and it went somewhere. And when it finally broke, it broke with all of that accumulated mass behind it. She'd been trained for a lot of things. She'd spent years in places and situations that had taught her to be precise, to be resourceful, to manage fear and fatigue and uncertainty without letting any of them make her decisions. None of that training had been specifically for this, but all of it had put her in the position to walk into that training hall and stand still after the slap and let the room understand, without a word, without a threat, without performing anything at all, that stillness was not the same as surrender. She'd just been what she was. And it turned out that being what she was, in that room, at that moment, had been enough to start something that the institution had spent 11 years trying to prevent from starting. That wasn't clean. It wasn't a story with a complete ending, because the IG's report would come out and be read and be argued over, and the reforms would be slow, and some of them would be watered down, and someone somewhere would find a way to route around them, because that was how institutions worked. It wasn't finished. But 31 names were in a record that would stay public. Sandra Moya's form letter was in a file that now had weight behind it. Cole's criterion, she looked like someone who wouldn't fight back, was documented in an official proceeding and would be read by people who needed to understand what that kind of thinking looked like in practice. And Daniel Moya was doing his morning exercises in a rehabilitation facility in a city 300 miles away, slightly ahead of his projected timeline, because a nurse had looked at a number on a chart and felt something wasn't right and had acted on that feeling before the monitors caught up. Small things. Enormous things. The same things, depending on where you were standing. Torres was still looking at her. "You're thinking too hard," he said. "Occupational habit," she said. "You should be proud," he said. "That's what I'm saying. You can just be proud." She looked at him. She thought about pride. What it actually felt like separate from what people performed when they wanted you to see it. It felt, she decided, quieter than its reputation. Less like triumph and more like being able to sit in a room at the end of a hard thing and know that the hard thing had been worth the difficulty. "Working on it," she said. Torres nodded, satisfied with that. She stood up, straightened his chart, and walked out into the corridor where the ward was doing what wards always did. Ongoing, imperfect, essential. The particular organized urgency of people who had chosen to spend their days on the boundary between crisis and recovery because something in them needed work that mattered at that scale. She walked it. The window at the end of the corridor looked out over the facility's north grounds, and the March light coming through it was, finally, starting to look like something that had decided to be spring. She stood there for one moment, not a long one, and let herself have it. Then she turned and went back to work. Because skills didn't ask to be recognized, they asked to be used. And she had work to do, and patients who needed her, and a position recommendation on her desk that she was going to read tonight with the honest part of her attention rather than the reflex part. And somewhere in the JAG files in the administrative block, 31 names were attached to reports that were finally going somewhere. That was the truth of it. Not clean, not complete, not the ending of anything so much as the beginning of a different kind of accounting. The kind that moved slowly and required maintenance and would occasionally backslide and needed people willing to stay in the room with it, even when the room was uncomfortable. Claire Bennett had been in uncomfortable rooms before. She knew how to stay.